And welcome to our weekly IG Live. Today I'm very excited to be talking to MaryAnne of Mama Smiles, although she actually has several blogs she can tell us about that. That's probably the main one that you would know her from. And she was one of the very first people I met when I started blogging many years ago, and she was a big help to me then and continues to be whenever I have questions about anything, and is very encouraging. And I know I'm not the only one who can say that. She's always very generous with her time to everybody who asks, even those of us who are much smaller bloggers than she is. But today we're going to be talking to her about something that you may not know about her, which is that she is really a world traveler and grew up going all around the world and continues to bring the joy of traveling to her own children. And it's talking about how you can do that with your family, especially in terms of education and extending learning on when you do trips together as a family. Hello. So we're going to be talking about that. She's going to share when she was a kid. And so we'll get to talk about that and her recommendations of how you balance trying to make it a learning experience with also just having it be a fun experience, which I think is something I always kind of tend to overdo it with, like, let's learn about this, and my kids want to just do something fun. So anyway, we'll talk about that. But welcome, MaryAnne.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So good to see you. Why don't we start? You can introduce yourself for those that don't know you. I think a lot of people probably already do, but give you a little introduction to yourself and your background and why this is a topic that's interesting for you.
Okay, I'm MaryAnne Kochenderfer. I blog over at mamasmiles.com, and I just came back from 3 months living in the UK with my 4 kids. We were really lucky we got to travel for my husband's work, which is on many levels, the easiest way to travel because you have assistance from like employers. I also grew up traveling. My dad was a career diplomat, so I was raised in 5 different countries, Central, South America, and Europe. But even before my father joined that career, he was a big, go see the world. He took us all the way from North Mexico almost down to the southern tip when I was 4. So I was raised in a family that's like, let's go see the world and let's experience everything.
That's amazing. What a great experience to have from such an early age. Do you think how do you think that shaped kind of your perspective on the world?
What I remember the most about that trip, that was my first time out of the United States, and I kind of thought, what I could see from my house was the world. And I remember driving past what I'd ever seen, realizing just how huge the world was, and it was a really exciting trip. And trips are always I find that there are always opportunities for extra family time, because when we're at home, we have so many just kind of things that are our routine at home that actually can pull us away from our families. And when we're on trips, we lose all of those surrounding, family distractions. And so lots of family time. And then what I remember the most about that trip in particular was we came back, and it was a few months afterwards that the big 1985 earthquake hit, and I remember the impact of that. Sorry, I'm still emotional. Just realizing, I think earthquakes are scary, right? But having just come back from those people and having that connection. Sorry, I'm like an emotional person apparently this morning.
Don't apologize.
It really makes you realize how small the world is, and that what's happening on those screens in places that can seem far away are not actually, they're people like you and they're people you love, and that it matters. Because I think if you don't have that privilege of traveling and seeing how alike we all are, it's easy to kind of have an us versus them ideology. And if you have the opportunity to travel, which again is such a privilege, and I want to talk about some ways you can travel without, having the resources necessarily to physically travel, because I do think it's possible to cultivate that same sense of knowing the world, even if you don't have the privilege of travel. But I think that had a huge impact on me, and it was something I wanted to give my children a sense of, like, really seeing how we are all very connected and what happens on the other side of the world matters.
I love that you mentioned that, because that you bring that up, and don't apologize for being emotional, because I think something that's happened now is that we all get the, what is it, is compassion fatigue. I'm not sure that, I'm not remember if I'm remembering the phrase exactly, because there's so much bad news happening. A lot of us tend to filter it out, and it doesn't affect us as much. Even, you know, today in the US, it's about mass shootings, or like you say, I mean, there's so many natural disasters and wars and things that are happening. And I think in a way we try to build a thick skin around, and like you say, it's easy to try and tune it out if we don't have any connection. And so travel is one way that we can work against that, make sure our kids do realize the impact of these places. And just because it's not in our hometown doesn't mean it's not important. And I, like you said, I think that it is something important that we need to pass on to our children, like you said, showing the interconnectedness. I would love to talk some more about, like you said, about how it is a privilege. And I know there's some people that really are kind of stuck where they are. Maybe they don't have the resources, or for whatever reason they're constricted. Sometimes it's health constraints or money, you know, and they're not able to travel. So I love that you're going to be talking about that. But why don't we start off just in general about learning opportunities when we travel? Although part of it, I think, is thinking outside the box about learning opportunities, because part of what you just talked about is learning about the world, is having this emotional connection, which is, maybe we don't think about that as a learning opportunity, but definitely is.
Yeah. There's so much. I mean, travel will open your mind in a way that it's an easy way to open your mind, right? I like to, before we travel, so this trip, we knew about it for a while, so we were visiting. I grew up, you know, like I said, partly in Europe, and this was a chance for my kids to get to know Europe, and I was like, oh, now you get to finally see, you know, this huge piece of my life that you haven't seen. And so I got like 40 puzzles of like Paris and London, where we go. And that was cool. My kids, I will say, you know, we talked about the fun, like, I was more into the 40 puzzles than my kids, and I want to emphasize that that's okay. Like, I think they built some of the 40 puzzle, that I built most of it. And first of all, I can keep learning, and I did. And also, it's, you know, it's all about the experience, and the more you do, the more you get out of it. And so that's okay if some things, like, you're excited about it, your kids are not psyched about. And I like to read, you know, historical fiction books. I like to read fiction. I like picture books from all over the world. And as you know, like, we've both been part of the Multicultural Children's Book Day for, I think, a few years, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a great way. These days, you know, you can watch shows from different countries on the internet. There's so much accessibility in ways we haven't seen before. My children, and now the youngest is 10 and the oldest is 17, and especially the teenagers for this last trip were very involved with the planning, which I loved, because they were, you know, I was like, you know, you can decide. My son had one road trip where he got to decide, and my daughter had a road trip where she was making most of the decisions. And that was cool, because having the decision-making power really motivated them to go do a deep dive on where we were going. Where I think if we had stayed in charge, then they might have been less, might have had less buy-in into the trip.
Definitely, that's a great tip. And because I was also thinking about, you know, like you mentioned, with 4 kids, how do you balance the different interests? Like, if one really wants to go more into history, another is more interested in science, or different areas. So that also seems like a nice way to kind of balance out their interests. Like, okay, one's in charge of one road trip, the other is in charge of another. Then they all kind of get a chance to do their interests, and also get an opportunity to learn to go along with the other people for a while.
Yeah, I will say my 15-year-old son especially, he made like little polls. He's like, what do people want to do? And he was working really hard to get a consensus about activities, which was also great practice, you know, for both of them. You know, my daughter was more like, this is what I want to do. And then she had to justify or make some changes based on feedback from the rest of us, where he took more of a, I'm going to find out first rather than, you know, it's just personality. Both approaches are perfectly valid. Mm-hmm. She's just happy to argue her point. She'd rather like not have, by the time he presents the plans, there aren't arguments because he's taken everything into account going in. Also, I want to say, so it's easy to focus on the, you know, the big tourist attractions. And those are amazing for a reason. They're famous for a reason. But I think some of the most memorable experiences aren't the tourist attractions. So like that I lived in Guatemala, but the Mexico trip, we went to visit some Mayan historic sites. And that was really memorable and really awe-inspiring. But I also remember like this sitting on the beach, and the sand at this beach was black, and I'd never seen black sand before. And I was like, wow, I didn't know black, you know, it was a big memory maker. Or I remember like seeing a green marble fountain somewhere on that trip, and I didn't know green. And those aren't things, you know, they're not on the tourist bucket list, but those were the things that were really memory making, and also always going into the little local shops. I think that's the absolute best way to learn about a culture. One of the highlights of our trip to the UK this last fall, there were a couple things that were more local. So I have a daughter who loves to ice skate, so they got to go take lessons from a local ice skating instructor. And since we were there for months, you know, this is something you can do. And that was such a cool experience because they teach it differently in England from how they teach it in California. And they got to learn from these instructors who had a completely different approach, and they're in a class with a bunch of English children, and that was really neat. And we went to a small town, and we found this little antique shop. And we think of antique shop as fancy furniture, but this was like letters from the early 1900s and pretty ordinary looking tea sets, but that are from, you know, 50, 100 years ago, and old magazines from the 1960s and records from the 1960s, and that was a really neat experience too.
I love that. And you know, that kind of gets to what I was talking about before about how do you balance stuff that's just fun versus kind of the official learning opportunities. And it sounds like what you're saying is that the kind of the ones that are on the travel bucket list, those are kind of the ones that we tend to think of as far as learning opportunities. But even just when you're having fun, like going to the beach or exploring little shops, there's so much learning that's happening, even if they're not necessarily aware of it, but that they're still picking up so much about local culture and habits and traditions and so on.
Yeah. And if you can learn things that aren't usually, you know, especially in a non-tourist format, you'll get to know more people, and they aren't necessarily, I love when they aren't packaging it for you because they know that you're coming from this culture and they're trying to make it be friendly for you. When they're just, you know, when you are the one who are making yourself friendly for them, that's when you'll learn more. When you're requiring the culture you're visiting to be friendly towards you, then you're limiting yourself. There was some, when I lived, so one of my father's postings when he was in the Foreign Service was Guatemala, and he signed us up for weaving lessons. So they do like backstrap traditional, you know, it's made out of sticks and yarn, and it's, you know, you sit on the floor and you have like a leather strap behind your back and it's tied to a tree. It's very, very traditional from hundreds of years ago. And he signed us up to take some lessons from someone there. And she wasn't advertising this. He was just like, you know, would you be willing to, and what would make it worth your time? And that was such a highlight to me. And I think that's where, you know, if you follow my blog, I like, especially on Instagram, I usually these days post like pictures of random things I make. And I attribute so much of that love of making things to that Guatemalan woman taking the time to teach me her, you know, it's a really incredible craft. I unfortunately don't remember how to do it, but it's kind of on my bucket list of like, maybe someday I can relearn how to do this.
Yeah, what an amazing experience. And to get to something that's so unique that you wouldn't get to do anywhere else. And it also kind of tied into your own interest. Yes, a wonderful way to learn about a culture, definitely. Do you have any other thoughts about things that you've done that, or with your kids, or that with you, that maybe were learning opportunities that maybe people wouldn't have thought about, or wouldn't have thought about them in terms of a learning experience. Like I love the idea of classes. That's whether it was the ice skating or with the weaving class, that's a great idea. I know I've seen people do some like around cooking, but not as much around like sports or things like that.
Yeah, I think with the internet, we're getting also, it might be a little easier to set those things up. Like I said, I've been living in Guatemala, and I think that's the only way we got access at the time, because we kept, visiting this woman. My parents really admired her work, and, they take us to see her work. So she knew who we were at this point, and we purchased some pieces from her and things like that. But when you're just traveling, you have a few days here and there. These days, if you like, people are able to advertise this kind of thing on the internet, but it doesn't need to be a class. I think people overlook how educational a grocery store trip is, for example. And because the foods are different, don't go try something that looks really strange. I love the UK, and a lot of Europe is big on cheese shops. I think that's an excellent cultural experience, and you can ask them what they would recommend for like something that tastes really different from cheese where you're from, or be really adventurous. We tried, the UK has their stinkiest cheese. It's called Stinking Bishop. And we tried it. It wasn't really like the flavor I expected, but I remember they're like, well, are you flying? Because we won't sell this to you if you're flying. It does enough to its day in terms of how it smells. It's very odorous. But then we tried it and we're like, it's not, compared to some other cheeses we tasted. And so, yeah, I think it was fun to try. We tried that one, which is the one they advertise, and that's kind of the tourist cheese, right? But then we were like, what do you recommend, for eating? And we discovered some cheeses we really loved that way.
What a fun way to try. I think food is such an easy way to get people hooked, because it's so much fun to try different foods. I know we tend to do ice cream wherever we go, which can be a little bit different. I mean, sometimes, but at least for my kids, especially if we've been dragging them around a lot of places, that's kind of an easy, something they can
okay. Yeah. That's a good tip also for traveling with kids, motivating them to keep walking. It's like, we will buy ice cream.
Yeah. Have you ever was there anything that you tried that didn't go as well as you expected, that you wish you had done differently, or something that would surprise you that maybe you had planned about and it just didn't really work out the way you thought it would?
Well, yeah, plenty of times. Road tripping across the U.S. I remember at one point we were driving through Arizona, and I discovered that my one child really hates cacti. She was just so done with cacti. So that's one that stands out. And then this last trip, I took my kids up to Scotland, and I spent 3 years. I went to grad school in Scotland. I know Scotland. I know Scottish weather. And I don't know where my brain was, probably because we've been, very mobile for a long time at this point. But I didn't bring any warm clothes up with us, and it was the coldest, windiest, rainiest day I had seen in Edinburgh for October 1st ever. And we got very wet, and I spent a lot of money on coats and boots. And, we were staying in England, so we wound up using them all fall. But things like that, the weather can be a big adventure. And for that kind of thing, like, always have something in your back pocket. I remember a trip with my family. We were living in France. We took the ferry. The tunnel wasn't built yet, but we took the ferry and we drove to Wales, and on this trip to Wales, it rained all the time. This last fall, we went to Wales, and it rained once, but that's incredibly lucky. But, it was just pouring buckets, and my parents found a library, and they got access to the library, and they got some books, or you can find a bookstore. And I think we played Uno for hours. Just always have a couple of portable things that you can do when things go terribly wrong. And also, I would say, if you're going to a big tourist attraction, be prepared it's okay to spend a lot of money on something, and if it's miserable, you're allowed to leave. And you need to, when you're deciding, like, do I want to budget for this or not? Am I willing to leave if it gets miserable, especially if it's a family sacrifice? Because I don't think it's necessarily worth it if everybody's making a terrible memory. At the same time, my kids still kind of laugh about that day up in Scotland. We got drenched. It was raining. The rain was hitting us sideways. we made it. It was okay.
One of those things that's a good memory later, not at the time.
Yes. I will say that's usually like we laugh about the cactus rant too. We call it like in the moment it was kind of annoying, but because what did the cacti do to you? I mean, they're still growing. But, all of the things, that's another thing, like when it's miserable, it will end. I remember as a child we once went camping in Denmark, and the top of our tent was not waterproof, but the bottom was.
Oh.
That's a bad way to camp, but good story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all building memories one way or another. But I love that. I love that you mentioned about that know when to leave if things are not going well, even if it costs a lot of money. Because I think, especially as parents, I think we have a tendency to like, no, we're going to tough this out because I spent a lot of money on this and it's not necessarily worth it. But also Uno. That's it. That's a great. We've done that on some small things, but that's a great idea just to always have something like that, because also there's I know there was one time we were waiting for a ferry in Costa Rica, and it ended up being so much longer of a wait because there was some kind of mechanical delay. I can't remember now what it was. This is a few years ago, and we ended up being stuck waiting there for hours. And if we had had something like that, that would have made it much more tolerable. I mean, we kind of came up with something to do just sitting there, but you have to be ready, because when you're traveling, very often things don't go to plan, and you have time when you're just sitting there and, you don't have access to all the normal stuff you'd have at home. So Uno is a great one, especially it doesn't take much room. It's very easy to carry. Or if, especially if you have small kids, I use like, if you have little games that you can play, like we used to do the going on a picnic game, where you name different foods through the alphabet. That I got a lot of long lines at airports, but
yeah, it's definitely easier. I mean, I've been traveling with my kids since they were teeny tiny because my family was in different countries from us usually, but it gets easier as they get older too, I'll say. So I do think though there's merit, like because they've traveled since they're small, they kind of accept things. Like you get to the airport. When we were leaving this fall, I don't remember how delayed we were, but it was a long delay. I mean, 6 hours, maybe 8 was a very long delay. And luckily they're used to it and they accept it and they're not shocked, even though it was honestly the worst delay we've personally experienced, which is probably lucky. 8 hours isn't that bad in the scheme of travel. But they had experienced it and they realized that, it's not the airline's fault, it's not anybody's, it's just this is how travel happens sometimes. And when we got to the UK and they had a lot of train strikes, and same thing. It made aspects of our travel a lot harder, but because they've done it, they understand that, this is part of traveling. And yes, you get tired and you get hot in the summer. Another thing I look for when things are going wrong, if you can access a local library or a small museum, like off the path, or these little quirky museums, those are often places that are like nice spaces to like get a break from the chaos of travel. They tend to be quiet. They tend to be clean. They have nicer bathrooms than you find in other places. So that's another thing I look for.
Oh, that's a good tip. Because I think sometimes we tend to go to like little restaurants or even, and those are often not calm or clean or
right.
So that's a good, especially libraries. I wouldn't have thought about trying to find a local library.
A lot of them. I mean, the UK has a good library system. It varies by country. France has nice bookstores, in my experience. It depends on the country. So bookstores are also another, just, obviously treat the books kindly, or ideally buy a couple. Don't just use a space. I think it's really important to remember you're a guest, and so you should be behaving politely like a guest.
Mm-hmm. And I also just want to go back to your point about traveling when your kids are little, because I think since you have older kids, that's a great perspective to offer, because I think people do often say, why are you going to bother traveling with kids? They're not going to remember it. But at the same time, like you're saying, you're kind of building up these patterns and they're so used to how things go that by the time they're older, they're not learning all this for the first time or encountering these things for the first time.
Yeah, I also think smaller children are less judgmental. So when things are differently from when they're at home, they're more accepting. And as you get older, you have to fight. You know, I think we have our biases, and our biases kind of build as we age, right? Unless we're actively trying to work against this. And even then, they probably still build, honestly. Uh, and if you can start young, then they're already, you know, they've been raised in this culture of accepting, and curiosity, I think, is huge. And that makes it easier. The other thing that makes it easier with the tourist attractions, so one way I like feel saner when it's a short trip, especially when I'm trying to see a lot, there's often like see if there's a city pass that saves you money, because that makes it easier to leave an expensive place, because you didn't pay just for that place, you paid for like the city pass, and I find it easier psychologically. And then historical societies, so like we went to Wales and we joined Cadw Wales, which is their historical thing. We've joined National Trust, and it often is better to join that, like, right, it's like an annual membership, but it'll pay for itself, especially if you have a bunch of kids. And if you join before you leave, you can arrive with the card, and they're pretty accommodating of travelers who have their act together enough to join and educate themselves about it.
And also that also goes back to what you were saying about being a guest and trying to contribute to the country that you're visiting, as because that's something you can do to help.
Absolutely. You know, on Cadw we maybe broke even, but it meant we could walk in a site and be like, oh, this wasn't really what I expected. Or some of the sites we visited didn't have entry fees, but they were part of Cadw, but we wouldn't have heard of them. We hadn't joined Cadw and been looking. So we found these little standing stones they're literally in the pasture behind, you know, or in front of a horse pasture. And they're off the beaten path, but they were very cool to see. And they aren't advertising them generally, but if you join, then you get access to all these sites, and they tell you. And so also made us go off the beaten path more than we might have without it. And I want these, you know, I want these sites to still continue to exist. Like you said, it's in my interest to support the foundations that keep them there for, you know, when my children or grandchildren, you know, I want people to continue to see these places. And so it is worth, every time you visit, respectfully, and especially if you do so with a donation or a membership, then you are protecting access for future generations.
Right. Oh, that's a great point. And thank you so much. I was just looking at the time, and I think I took a little more time than I told you I would. So I want to wrap up, but thank you so much for sharing all your experiences with it. There's a lot of points that you brought up that I hadn't thought about before. And I just want to end, I want to give you a chance to give a plug, to plug your blog, because you have more than one and people may not necessarily be aware of that. Could you just kind of give us an overview of where people can find you?
Yeah, so I have 3, but they get like different. Mamasmiles.com is my original one, and that's like parenting, education, craft stuff. It's travel. Most of my travel stuff is there. I have a book blog called Great Family Reads, and I try to highlight books. It's not built up as much as I want, but I think the posts that are there are useful. And I actually have a space there where you can request a book list. So if you're like, I want a book list about this, feel free to request, and I'll try to accommodate that. And then I have Top Toy Finds, which gets the least attention. But again, I think I have some good content there.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that you kind of separated, you know, kind of your interests out. But if you are interested, especially the ones that travel, that like we've been talking about, go to mamasmiles.com, as well as crafts and parenting, as you mentioned. But especially, I know you've blogged quite a bit about the UK trip, so you can find all of that.
Yeah, and I have more to write, so there will be new content.
Oh, good. So. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're quite busy, so I appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody.